Good evening to all our attendees and indeed our panelists, and welcome to this IDFOC webinar on defending an independent Scotland. And we have an excellent panel here this evening. If I may just quickly run through the names, we have Angus Robertson, Phillips O'Brien, Stuart Crawford and Dorcha Lee, all who are going to give us some insight into the issues that would from a defence point and security point of view that would arise in the context of an independent Scotland. So as we have people still joining us, let me explain the format for the evening. Each of the panelists will be invited to make opening remarks for 8 or 10 minutes, and then we open up for Q&A, and we use the Q&A functionality on Zoom here. So if people want to ask questions, I'm very welcome to do so. Please use the Q&A functionality, and we will then open up the panel discussion and put the questions to the panel before we have some closing remarks, and we draw the webinar to a close. Also to say that we are recording the webinar, and usually if the recording goes well, we put it up on our IDFOC YouTube channel, so that it can be accessed again by people who may want to rewatch it, or those who weren't able to join us this evening. So a big thank you to all our panelists, and indeed to all of you for taking time out this evening to tune in tonight and join us on the webinar. Our first speaker tonight, Angus Robertson, has just been selected to run for the Scottish Nationalist Party in Central Edinburgh. Congratulations, Angus. Angus is a former MP for Moray and was the SNP Westminster leader and deputy leader of the SNP. He is a journalist and author. And Angus this evening will talk about the challenges of developing a defence policy for an independent Scotland, a little bit about the 2014 independence referendum white paper, a bit about Brexit and support today for Scottish independence, and a few words possibly around Indie reference referendum number 2. So Angus, delighted to invite you to talk now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maliosa. Thank you to the fellow panelists. Thank you to the members of the Irish Defence Forces Officers Club. I'm very honoured to be able to speak to you this evening, and thank you for taking time out to hear a little bit about where Scotland is now and how we got to where we are now and where we might be going soon. And I think that doesn't just matter, obviously, to people in Scotland. It matters to people in our direct neighbourhood, obviously people in the rest of the UK, and very obviously also in Ireland, north and south. Little bit of extra background on top of what Maliosa just shared with you. I was the Scottish National Party's defence spokesman for 15 years. I represented the most defence-dependent constituency in Scotland, Moray, which was home to the RAF's Quick Reaction Alert base at RAF Lossiemouth, and the Maritime Reconnaissance base at RAF Kinloss. I'm a graduate of the UK Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. I served for a number of years on the Intelligence and Security Committee of the House of Commons, overseeing MI5, MI6, GCHQ. I wrote the SNP's defence policy, and I fronted the SNP's defence case in 2014. So it's something I've been intimately involved with, and I'd like to take you through some of that, as Malios has already outlined. Firstly, a little bit about developing defence policy for an independent Scotland. This moved on to a new footing after the 2011 Scottish Parliament elections, where the SNP secured a majority, elected on a manifesto commitment to hold an independence referendum, with the expectation that a referendum would be held, and that the case for independence being put forward by the SNP needed to stand the test of scrutiny, point 1, and point 2, delivery after a yes vote in independence. This undertaking was pursued vigorously, to say the least. I spent a lot of time, as did other colleagues, visiting neighbouring countries, including Ireland. We've spent quite a lot of time in Denmark, in Norway, in Sweden, and in Iceland in particular, for reasons that will become obvious in a moment. I think the key starting point for us at that stage was to think like a state, to act like a state. We needed to better understand what were the needs, the interests, the concerns, the expectations of neighbouring countries, and what was it that Scotland needed to do more than the sort of historic SNP position, which is the SNP is a profoundly anti-nuclear weapons party. Scotland is the home of the entire UK nuclear fleet, and in parallel to that, there has been a historic commitment to wish to support United Nations peacekeeping in a way that Ireland shines a light for the rest of us that we would like to emulate. Having gone to see our neighbouring nations, and in this context I leave Ireland out, again for reasons that will be obvious for people watching this webinar, Scotland is not part of a neutral state, and we find ourselves in a key geostrategic location. North of Scotland is the Iceland Gap, to our west the Atlantic, to the east the North Sea. And when speaking with Danes, Norwegians, and Icelanders in particular, and I'm leaving out Americans and Canadians, although spoken to them both as well, understanding the key location that Scotland is in is understanding the expectation that an independent Scotland would have to take its defence requirements seriously, which posed a question in the run-up to the independence referendum about the detail of the case that needed to be pursued. So in the run-up to 2014, I redrafted, updated, it was the most significant update in SNP defence and security policy in a generation at least, which you can look at in great detail online if you're interested in that. And the centrepiece from a media perspective was that the SNP position would evolve from inheriting our responsibilities within NATO to being a partner for peace, something that Ireland is, but would evolve our responsibility by remaining in NATO as a member state for a number of reasons that were explained to us, again, especially speaking to Danish, Norwegian and other neighbours, that having an integrated defence system, particularly around our northern threats, which I say euphemistically for the interest that is shown by the Russians, effectively turning off the radar screen for all of our northern neighbours was going to be particularly difficult for them to A, understand or B, fill that gap where an independent Scotland to become the first NATO member state to leave, or part of a member state to leave. So that was the part of the SNP's defence policy that was updated, that received the most attention. In many respects, the rest of the policy was actually more fundamentally important. Why? Because as then went on to be publicised in the white paper that the SNP went to the country on in 2014, it was literally the only departmental spending commitment in the entire white paper, with detailed plans of what a Scottish government expected to inherit post-independence, what one wanted to inherit, what the defence posture of an independent Scotland would be like, which structure would be pursued subject to a defence review shortly after independence. Again, if people watching this webinar are interested, please, you just need to Google Scottish Government White Paper 2014. You can read the chapter on defence and security. It's extremely detailed. And I know that one of the other panelists is going to talk a little bit about what role this played in the 2014 referendum. Can I just say, from my perspective, as the person who fronted it from the pro-independence part of the argument, I actually think it didn't play a tremendously large part in the 2014 referendum. And one of the reasons why was that we actually had a fully costed, thought-through proposal. It's not that it didn't have consequences, of course it did. Some people liked those, some people didn't like those. But unlike previous years where we had less of a well-developed policy framework, in 2014 we did. Couple of points before moving on to the rest of the panel. Where do we find ourselves now? Obviously, we're not in 2014, but now in 2020, we are literally at the high point in support for Scottish independence. We are now, I think, by my reckoning, on the 11th or 12th opinion poll in a row, showing consistently and growing majority support for independence. Aggregate number would be anything between 54 and 58 would be the high point in recent polling, but a total reversal from 2014. And there's also a growing view, even amongst those who do not want independence, that A, there should be a referendum if there is a pro-independence majority returned in next year's Scottish Parliament elections. And secondly, again, even amongst people who do not support Scottish independence, an expectation that it is going to happen. Brexit is the biggest single reason why there has been a shift in opinion. People were told to vote no in 2014 to protect Scotland's place within the UK and European Union, but we're now being taken out against our will, as people will be well aware. India Ref 2, just a quick point or two on all of that. I think the white paper is an excellent starting point for an updated prospectus going to the country in the next independence referendum. One area where I think there is room for development would be on the wider security question, particularly on cyber security. I think there's a challenge to us all, obviously. We're well aware of that. And I think that is an area that we are going to have to pay more attention to. I would very much like and look forward to an independent Scotland cooperating not just with our NATO allies in a Northern European context, but with close allies, not least the Irish Republic. I think we have a lot to learn from you, both in regards to peacekeeping operations, but also the shared responsibility that you have with fellow EU member states. And I think there's a very natural fit between Ireland, Scotland, and the other northern neighbours that you currently serve with in an EU context. And that's one that I would be very much in favour of. Right, you said 8 to 10 minutes. I think I'm probably at my 10 minutes rather than my 8 minutes, so I will stop there, hand over to panelists, and delighted to answer questions that might come later. Thank you very much again for having me.
Thank you very much, Angus. That's very good. Just to mention also that while you were speaking, Phillips did put up a link in the comments to the white paper that you refer to. So if people want to download it, they can just click on in the chat function there on the link to download it. Delighted to see so many attendees on this evening. We have 63 people who joined us this evening, and which brings me on to our next speaker, Phillips. Phillips O'Brien is the Professor of Strategic Studies at St Andrews University. He's a writer, historian, and TV presenter. So Phillips is quickly going to take a quick run through about how defence played out in the last referendum and maybe in the next referendum, and also talk about kind of structures, looking at other comparative models in Europe. So Phillips, over to you. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks for having me very much on this. My own research, for people who've read my book, was mostly about the Second World War era, but what I'm sort of interested in generally is the intersection of domestic politics and strategy and defense policy, which all have figured in this debate over what whether Scotland should be independent, and if so, what kind of defense it would have. I think I have enormous respect for what Angus did in the last referendum, because defense was one of those issues that opened up a lot of fault lines between the SNP as a party, you might say, and the general Scottish population. Now, as Angus said, 100%, defense was not just the decisive issue in the last referendum. Far from it. It was really a contributory issue. But you might say it was also an issue which framed certain ideas and discussions and debates, because it was one that the No campaign tried to use very strongly against the independent side. That it was one that the No campaign was trying to call into credibility the Yes campaign by saying they don't really have a serious defense policy, that their their plans won't work. And what they tried to do is drive a wedge between what might say was an opinion of those who long-standing opinion of those who support Scottish independence, particularly through the SNP and CND, and then the Scottish population as a whole, because there was a distinct fault line between that. that there has been a very strong, powerful, vocal element within the SNP for a long time. That indeed, that's one of the reasons I supported the SNP and Scottish independence, because they wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons. It was an anti-nuclear element. And that was very passionately felt by many people in the SNP, and it represented a significant core within the party. From what we can tell on opinion polls, however, Scots as a whole are much more in line with Britain as a whole when it comes to defense issues. You know, they're pro-NATO. They're no more or less anti-nuclear than Britain as a whole. So that you might say that there is this difference between the two that had to be to sort of bridge that had to be, or this gap that had to be bridged within the campaign. There was also, by the way, enormous pressure being put, and I can say this as someone who's not in the SNP, but who talked to foreign diplomats who were represented in Scotland during this. There was enormous pressure being put on the SNP to stay in NATO. When we talk about, you know, the neighbors, countries like Denmark, Norway, indeed France, who view NATO as incredibly important in their defense, the last thing they wanted to do was to see the breakup of the United Kingdom, which would lead to a significant part of the United Kingdom, which has this important strategic location in Scotland, leave NATO. And I think you can't underestimate the pressure that they would have put on the SNP for that. That they were already wary enough about Scottish independence, but they didn't want Scottish independence to lead to what they would call a significant diminution of NATO's ability. So these were sort of the kinds of pressures that were being put on the SNP with that. And the party was, during this process, quite painfully in many ways, forced to adapt its policy. And you can see that in the white paper. The white paper is actually has quite a long and detailed part on defense. And it does try to sort of feed to both sides within this debate. I would say within the confines of the debate in 2014, defense was probably not one that worked very much in the SNP's favor beyond, it did seem to be that the anti-nuclear crowd backed it in 2014. But on the other hand, it didn't sort of swing those who might be more mainstream in their defense and foreign policy views over to believe that an independent Scotland would necessarily be a productive backer of NATO. So it sort of played this hybrid role in the debate. Going into the next campaign, I say actually in many ways, if we're building on what Angus has said, the independence campaign would be in a much stronger position, because what has happened is I don't quite believe anymore that the strong anti-nuclear element is going to be as vital to getting an independence vote through, because what has happened as the Brexit debate has transformed who and why people are backing Scottish independence. It's become very much one of being sort of part of having a pan-European identity, being Europeans in many ways more than British. And someone who's now, myself, who's lived in Scotland for 25 years, I would say most of the people I know, and certainly particularly the younger they are, the students that I come across, they would consider themselves Scottish/European. They wouldn't consider themselves British. And the Brexit debate has absolutely opened up this fault line. So when it comes to the next referendum campaign, and I can speak completely as I'm not a member of the SNP, but I certainly look at independence as something that needs to be considered very seriously. I think in many ways you want to play yourself as the cooperative European. And that would have to be, we do want to be an enthusiastic member of NATO. And I know that partnership for peace is something that people talk about. I don't even think that really is the way to go. I think it's saying we would be a full and enthusiastic member of NATO, because we don't want to represent this. We don't want to call into question anything that would get us into the European Union. It's about sort of being cooperative with European powers. And it's keeping them all on side. So I would argue that when it comes time for the referendum to actually be in many ways, to appeal to the center, because what has happened, it's the center that's now moved to back Scottish independence in this evolution in regards to Brexit. Now, that brings up to say, if you are a NATO power, you know, if you, not a large power, but a small NATO country, if independence occurs, and we could talk about how independence might work in the next referendum, I would say to be in many ways quite mainstream on that, what kind of defense force structure would you have? Now, one of the issues in the last debate, and I know I'm eating up time, so I'll try and make this quite focused, was indeed the present force structure that the UK has in Scotland is deeply unbalanced, because it's the force structure of a large NATO power with some international force, and that you have, you know, almost all naval assets are on the Clyde in Faslane. And one of the problems that the Yes campaign had in 2014 was to try and reassure this area, which is out in the Clyde, in the Faslane area, that they would try and protect these jobs. And what they said is, okay, you know, we're going to build, you know, make Faslane our central base. Well, Faslane is a brilliant base if you want to run nuclear submarines out of them. It's probably the worst possible base if you want to have an integrated force structure for the defense of Scotland. It's very good if you wish to invade Ireland, but it's probably not much use for a lot of other things, because it's actually try to get from Faslane to the oil fields, you know, your actual assets which you have to defend, and you'd have to go all the way around Scotland to get there. So I've been sort of playing with different defense models that Scotland might follow. And actually, I was really drawn, if people, I would argue, to the defense model that works best for an independent Scotland as a cooperative NATO power, is that is based on the Danish model. The Danish have divided their forces up in two significant bases with two quite distinct areas. One of them could be a Scottish Faslane, and another one would be located in the Scottish Northeast. The Danish bases are Corsor and Frederikshaven, if you want to go through the breakdown. And basically what they've done is they've set up one for what we'd call local defense. And Denmark, by the way, is not a bad comparison to Scotland, because it also has an enormous reach in its local defense. You might think Denmark's local defense is the Baltic or the North Sea, but they will define their local defenses going all the way out to the Faroe Islands and Greenland. So that they actually have this quite, in many ways, that a Scottish territorial waters and then beyond that, your Scottish area of defense coverage is going to be significant to the north. Denmark has a significant reach. So they've set up this one base which looks after defense structures in the local area out to the Faroes and Greenland, but then they set the other one up to be very much, we might say, international participation. And they've defined that very interestingly as an integration of both possible military and humanitarian. You might say the deployability squadron. And I think that works really well with Scotland, because I think what you would do is you would set up the international force in Faslane, so that you could build this force that could cooperate with NATO. I mean, on a small scale, obviously, Scotland won't be a large power, could cooperate with NATO internationally, but could also be deployable for humanitarian concerns. If anyone knows Faslane, it itself doesn't have an airstrip, but actually it's close to two quite large airstrips. You have both Glasgow Airport, but also Prestwick, which is under the control of the Scottish government for now. And so you could find ways to use the airfield there for the deployability. And then you'd have to set up some kind of force in the Northeast, which would be the local defense force, which would look after the oil fields, the patrolability up to the north, again, to work with sort of more localized defense. So I'll cut off there. I think I've been talking for about 10 minutes, but I think defense, it could go from being a quite tricky issue in the last referendum to, if properly put together for this referendum, something that could be actually quite reassuring to the center voter who has now switched to independence.
Thank you very much, Phillips. Excellent. We will just to invite people, if they want to ask questions, to use the Q&A functionality here. and we would invite questions to the panel as we discussed afterwards. I am getting some through by email as well, so I will also, if emails come in, also take those questions. So our next panelist is Stuart Crawford. Stuart is a retired Lieutenant Colonel in the Royal Tank Regiment, graduate of the UK and US staff colleges. He's regarded as leading Scottish defence analyst, formerly SNP military advisor, and an author. So Stuart, I understand you're going to give some background and context, talk a bit about assumptions, methodology around designing armed forces, something about a bit about the threats and risks to Scotland and independent Scotland, a possible model for the Scottish Defence Forces. Phil has covered that as well, and the lease back of the independent Scotland military bases to the rest of the UK. So, Stuart, intrigued to see how you're going to cover all that in 10 minutes. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Wes, and good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to be able to take part in this webinar tonight, a subject close to my heart. I would say that you've heard the political and academic views from my friends and colleagues, Angus and Phillips, and what I'm trying to do tonight is give you a soldier's view, which may have some resonance with some of you. I've been writing and commenting for the past 20 years or so on how an independent Scotland might go about organising its self-initiated work, and there's been no commercial or political sponsorship of what we've been doing. I've been aided greatly by my friend recently, Richard Marsh, an economist who advises the Scottish Government and was part of the Growth Commission report panel of experts, which was headed up by former SNP MSP Andrew Wilson, looking at the economics of independent Scotland. Our major piece of work, that's Richard and I, is entitled "All the Blue Bonnets Defending an Independent Scotland," which was published by the Royal United Services Institute in October 2012 and is still available as a free download on their website. And perhaps Phillips will put up a link to that if he's listening. We've updated that piece of work incrementally in 2 short papers published in 2018 and again this year. Now, our work is of course hypothetical, and we have based our hypothesis on several assumptions. First of all, we've assumed that an independent Scotland's foreign and defence policies would have a regional rather than a global focus primarily, although the government would wish to have some capability to contribute to global events in coalition or partnership. Next, we agree broadly with Andrew Wilson and his Growth Commission report that an independent Scotland could well undergo a period of fiscal austerity for up to 25 years after independence. And indeed, his most recent comments have reinforced that. We think that an independent Scotland would not wish or nor could afford a full spectrum military capability in its early years of existence at least, and would therefore specialise in some functions while looking to allies to fill capability gaps. Independent Scotland would also seek to join NATO and whichever European defence alliances might be appropriate. And accordingly, taking all those together, we believe that the Scottish defence capabilities will exclude high-end weaponry like aircraft carriers, submarines, tanks, attack helicopters, heavy artillery, and modern fast attack aircraft. And of course, there will be no independent nuclear deterrent. Now, in terms of methodology, most commentators on Scottish defence adopt one of 2 models, either the comparative one, and you've heard about Denmark, in which they look at other small and similar countries, or they take a percentage of putative gross domestic product, usually the NATO average spend of defence spend of 1.6%, and apply that to get a possible defence budget figure. I believe that both those methodologies are weak and have adopted a process, the military appreciation or combat estimate, and adapted it for our purposes here. There are 3 simple steps to this in its most basic form. You identify the threats and risks, you decide what armed forces you need to counter such threats and risks, and then you calculate if you can afford them. It's an iterative process, and you can repeat until you come up with something that is both credible and within budget. Now, looking at the threats and risks, Those which might face an independent Scotland are very much the same as those which would face all small regional powers. The usual combination of terrorism, cybercrime, migration, industrial espionage, theft, pandemics, and so on. And I think it's fairly safe to assume that there is unlikely to be any direct threat to Scotland's territorial integrity in the short and medium terms. I don't think anybody's going to invade us for our whisky or our fish farms or our tourism. And sadly, of course, the oil and gas sector is in decline. What Scotland does have, and you've heard this before, is its geostrategic position. We sit in the southern end of the strategically important Greenland-Iceland-UK gap and sea routes into the North Atlantic. The Russian Navy, and if the ice cap keeps melting, the Chinese Navy, which is now the largest in the world, would wish to get into the open waters of the Atlantic. Plus, of course, we sit on the northern exit entrance to the Irish and the North Sea, and many transatlantic air routes overfly our country. So Scotland is in an ideal position to monitor, patrol, police, and interdict where necessary these physical communication routes, and of course to provide safe passage for its own and friendly nations. But I don't think it can do it on its own. Now, maybe at this point I should just outline very broadly what Richard Marsh and I came up with in terms of what an independent Scotland's armed forces might look like. Remembering always, of course, that this is only a model, not the model. By 2018, we had moved away from the army-heavy model of our original 2012 paper and revised it to comprise a navy of maybe 20 hulls and 2,500 personnel, an air force of maybe 50 aircraft and UAVs and 2,000 personnel, and an army of approximately 6,000 personnel, totaling with an allowance for headquarters about 11,000 personnel all told. This represented a 30% reduction on our 2012 figures. Significantly, we thought that the budget would drop to between 1.1 and 1.3 billion pounds per annum. And for comparison, the Growth Commission report speculated on a defence budget of 2.6 million, twice what we are advocating. Some people have called this the Irish model, some people have called it the New Zealand model, but I think it's very specifically a Scottish model, but as I said, not the model. Our latest short paper dealt with the idea that Scotland might be able to defray the costs of its defence budget by leasing some military sites to friendly nations or organisations, principally, of course, the rest of the UK. And of particular interest in this regard are the Faslane Naval Base and RAF air bases at Lossiemouth and Loss. The Faslane Base is the second largest single site employer in Scotland. How many are directly or indirectly employed by the complex is a matter of some debate, but a reasonable estimate might be in the region of 11,000. The base is important, of course, because it houses the 4 nuclear-powered ballistic missile-armed submarines of the UK's independent nuclear deterrent, and it will shortly be home to the UK's entire submarine fleet and a number of other surface vessels. Now, we are all clear, I think, that militarily and politically, an independent Scotland would not wish to maintain its own nuclear deterrent, nor would it be able to afford its own submarine fleet in the early years of the new nation, at least, and possibly not at all. It's also a popular concept amongst Scottish nationalists that as soon as Scotland becomes independent, the Scottish government of the day would demand the immediate removal of nuclear weapons from the Clyde. This is highly unlikely to happen, if only because in the short to medium term, the Trident boats have nowhere else suitable to go in the UK. But more importantly, demanding their removal in short order would arguably be calling for the United Kingdom to unilaterally disarm, and the chance of that happening is close to zero. The USA, for example, has said it would not countenance it and would block an independent Scotland's accession to NATO. It is likely, therefore, that the nuclear submarines will have to remain in Faslane Crewport for perhaps up to 20 years, whilst an alternative basing solution is sought and built. This being the case, it seems perfectly reasonable to suggest that Scotland could lease the base to the remainder of the UK for the period. The question, of course, is for how much? Now, the detail of that is beyond my ken and the scope what I can bring to the debate tonight. But my colleague Richard Marsh, the economist, has put a lease rental value of around £200 million per annum as charges which might be made to the rest of the UK for continued use of the facility. I think personally that this errs on the modest side, but he's the economist, not me. A similar exercise might be undertaken with regard to RAF Lossiemouth-Kinloss. As Angus has already said, Lossie is now one of the 2 UK main operating bases for the Eurofighter Typhoon and the only operational flying RAF station in Scotland, currently home to 4 squadrons of Typhoon, which contribute to the Quick Reaction Alert Interceptor North Force, ensuring continuous protection of UK airspace. More recently, it's also become home to the UK's embryo Poseidon maritime reconnaissance capability, and is also used by the Norwegian and US Poseidon aircraft, plus various other aircraft from friendly nations. However, arguably, no rent lease should apply here, as the quid pro quo for allowing friendly nations to use Lossiemouth as a base might be the air defence of Scotland, both interceptors and maritime reconnaissance aircraft. Nonetheless, we calculate that a combination of renting Faslane and the many other military facilities in Scotland, together with the wider economic benefits that accrue with servicing and maintaining these facilities to their local economies, might be very close indeed to our estimated defence budget of 1.1 to 1.3 billion. In other words, an independent Scotland could possibly get its defence for free. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart, for that. That's very interesting. We have some questions coming in here, but just to invite more questions, and we'll take them after our final speaker, who's Dorcha Lee. Dorcha is a former colonel in the Irish Army, retired now. He was the Provost Marshal and Director of Military Police. He has been an international election observer, a defence analyst, is a chartered linguist, which helps, I'm sure, when you're abroad on elections. A graduate of the Irish, US and French staff colleges and service schools. Over to you now. I'll just get you unmuted here, Dorcha. Yep, over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and a special welcome to our viewers in Scotland and Catalonia. My comments are really about what Scotland could learn from the Irish experience when planning to create the future Scottish Defence Forces. The details originally were in a paper which was published by the IIEA, which I wrote, Reflections on the Defence of an Independent Scotland, A View from Ireland. The late Colonel E.D. Doyle often described the Irish Defence Forces' big dilemma as the problem of the miniature army. Once you're committed to having conventional defence forces, you're obliged to have in miniature all the combat support and combat service support elements that larger armies have in order to sustain the combat units. This means, just to take an example, having the same diversity of military schools as larger armies. The current Scottish units of the UK Armed Forces are well supported in this regard. However, with independence, the entire range of support will have to be created, with a consequent disproportionate number of personnel required to support a smaller number of fighting troops. In addition, the miniature army must cover the wide spread of functional areas required by units and by individuals, making it hard to develop teamwork and properly achieve training targets. For example, as second-in-command and acting battalion commander, I once found myself in charge of an understrength unit, simultaneously providing long-distance cash escorts, with a platoon on prison guard duty in Portlaoise, another platoon on UN service in Lebanon, and yet another in training to replace them. Moreover, the battalion provided most of the administrative staff required to run one of the largest barracks in the Defence Forces, for which, incidentally, I was also commanding officer, acting commanding officer. But the miniature army problem of excessive multifunctioning is not just a unit one. It extends also to the individual soldier. A newly arrived defence attaché was surprised to notice a tall, grey-haired corporal firing a 120mm mortar at a shoot in the Glen of Amal artillery range. He saw him later that evening supervising waiters at dinner in the officers' mess. The following morning, during an official departure of the President from Dublin Airport, the attaché spotted the corporal again in the President's Guard of Honour on the tarmac. So the first lesson from the Irish experience for an independent Scotland is to staff up the SDF, Scottish Defence Forces, properly. Get the organisation right. Employ more civilians if necessary, and don't tie down operational units with too much barracks administrative duties. Above all, beware of the enthusiasts calling for more teeth and less tail. That simply doesn't work, any more than being a jack of all trades and a master of none. Scotland will truly take its place among the nations of the world when the first SDF unit, be it Navy, Army or Air Force, deploys on a peace support mission. While Ireland had observers deployed to Lebanon in 1958, it was the deployment of infantry battalions to the Congo in 1960 that captured the national sense of pride in our defence forces. Despite relatively heavy casualties in the beginning, this national sense of pride lasts to this day. The SDF should really build up a corporate knowledge of peacekeeping before sending troops abroad. I would recommend that the SDF starts first with observer missions and also avail of training offered by a number of foreign service schools which specialise in this area, foremost of which I would include the United Nations Training School, Ireland. Because of the miniature army problem, it has always been impossible for Ireland to field an entire home-based unit for peace support operations. Instead, composite units are formed for each 6 months' tours of duty. Team building with composite units takes much longer than with home units, where people are used to working together, perhaps over years. For our army, it only works because of the high number of experienced personnel in each overseas unit with multiple missions completed. A relatively new feature of UN peacekeeping missions is the deployment of mixed Irish-Finnish and currently Irish-Polish battalions. Apart from language issues, interoperability is essential to achieve the necessary level of coordination for operations. I do think that the new Scottish Defence Force could benefit greatly by forming a battalion with the more peacekeeping experienced Irish. The proposals for a Scottish Navy and Air Force present the Scottish Defence Forces with the opportunity to participate in multinational peace support missions, whether under the UN, the EU, or the NATO flags. To date, Ireland has been unable to deploy naval or air corps units on peace support operations, but our naval service has successfully carried out humanitarian operations in the Mediterranean. However, individual members of the Air Corps and Naval Service have served with distinction on peace support missions over the years. When the first Irish battalion went to the Congo in 1960, they were poorly equipped, low in firepower, with Lee Enfield's No. 4 Mark II bolt-action rifles. They wore heavy World War I style bull's wool uniforms, as advised, to absorb the sweat. However, an Irish firm supplied somewhat impractical but magnificent combat rations, which became highly prized due to the incredibly high standard of haute cuisine. Sadly, the lack of firepower and armour personnel carriers contributed to the high level of casualties sustained in the early years. Lessons were quickly learned, and nowadays Irish units are equipped for peace support operations to world-class standards. Lest we forget, yesterday, the 8th of November, was the 60th anniversary of the ambush at Niamba, where 9 Irish soldiers died on UN service. One other lesson learned the hard way was never to trust an international organisation with promises to supply equipment or services. Contingents should be sent overseas fully kitted out, unless a specific support activity can be verified as being in place before the deployment occurs. Like the Irish Defence Forces, the Scottish Defence Forces will always be in competition with the UK Armed Forces over recruitment of personnel. The strong family traditions of service in the UK Armed Forces will not end overnight, and the diversity of opportunities offered by the UK will be difficult to match. However, the Irish model of the soldier being part of the community has its advantages. The first consideration is that the soldier in Ireland is a citizen of the state and not a servant of the monarch. This means that the soldier has the full rights of a citizen, including access to civilian courts. The only exceptions are the ban on taking industrial action, on commenting publicly on service matters, and in the case of regular personnel, the ban on being a member of a political party. Members of the Defence Forces have the right to vote and participate in representative associations. The representative associations are not allowed to get involved in operational matters, but they have access to the Minister for Defence. They hold annual conferences to which the media have access and can make statements from time to time on pay and conditions. But unfortunately, the problem for the Irish Defence Forces is that governments can and do ignore requests for fair pay and conditions, knowing that the military cannot strike. Also, the population in Ireland has little knowledge or appreciation of national defence issues, as this subject has been ignored by our educational system. The Defence Forces are now the lowest paid in the Irish public sector, with falling strength levels for the past 5 years. The big lesson for the SDF from the Irish experience is that personnel should be properly paid and given good conditions of service, at least on a par with the police. For international comparison, in this area, choose Norway rather than Ireland. On the other hand, Scotland should consider the Irish model of the soldier being at the heart of the community as far as possible. If the troops are paid properly, they should be able to live in the community after their first year in service. The construction of new barracks should reflect a geographical outreach that favours recruitment policy. Ideally, perhaps 80% of other ranks should be able to keep their local roots, play their part in the local community, and still live all their lives within commuting distance of barracks. In conclusion, an independent Scotland's Defence Forces can learn much from our Defence Forces. They do not have to reinvent the wheel. I'm finished, Willie, sir.
I know, I've just managed to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Dr. And all the panelists are now unmuted, so it's open season. Quite a few questions have come in, and some have come in, also some comments rather than questions. So I will start to work my way through them. And unfortunately, I haven't had an opportunity to bunch them together, so we might be jumping around the place. But if I start with, and also some of the questions reflect whether the person asking the question is in Scotland or in Ireland. So, for example, one of the questions from one of our Irish attendees has asked, and maybe this is one for Angus, you know, would Scotland seek to rejoin the European Union immediately?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and thanks to the fellow panelists for their contributions and thoughts. Although I think, in fairness, although I know and greatly respect Stuart, I think it's him speaking from a military man's perspective, myself speaking from the perspective of somebody who served in elected office. I think the idea that a Scottish National Party government would ever lease Faz Lane for money to maintain nuclear weapons operating from Scotland's shores is so far from political reality. One can discuss, you know, how clever this is. One could make money on it and all of that, which I know is the perspective that Stuart's coming from. But just for the perspective of people watching this, leave you in absolutely no doubt. There is zero chance of that happening. I should say, echoing the position of both the Danish and the Norwegian governments, who both of whom do not allow nuclear vessels to be based in their military facilities. On the European question that you asked about, Maliosa, the SNP's position is to seek readmission, as it will be, to the European Union, and I can see the questions that are being asked. Perhaps I've had a look at some of them, and I might be able to skip over a couple of them because they do fit, if you're agreeable with that, because there's some that are probably more for me, and there's some that are probably more for some of the other panelists. Fraser Stark asks a question. He says, hopefully a yes or no. Is there likely to be an updated white paper before the 2021 election? I would be guessing no, because what there will be is a political manifesto for the Scottish National Party should the SNP win the election, and there be yet another mandate for an independence referendum. It's at that stage that the Scottish Government would develop a white paper. So that would be after May next year, and I would very much hope that it's as detailed as the last one. Will it be a first principles assessment followed by recommendations, or a cover for an answer that is desired politically, e.g. reinstating more infantry battalions and needed for a single brigade? Yes, it will be first principles. It's something that my successor, Stuart MacDonald, as the MP for Glasgow South, has already been conducting for the party, and that will feed into what the government is doing. The commitment to reinstate the historic traditions of military units continues, but that in Scottish Defence Force terms, that one would be mirroring exactly what infantry battalions did before has never been the case that has been put. Bill Austin asked about a Scottish Customs Service. To be honest, that is exactly the kind of question that needs to be looked at as part of a defence and wider security review after independence, because one wants to make sure that everything knits together as much as possible. Just very briefly on the question of exporting talent, speaking as somebody who met a very decorated Irish Defence Force sergeant serving with the British Royal Marines, after long service with the IDF. I'm aware this is a relevant issue for people with long service experience with the IDF. It is the case that people have served in both armed forces on these islands. No doubt that will continue, but the advantages to many people of wanting to have a full and successful military career whilst actually being based close to home and being able to develop as much as a normal life as one possibly can in a military context, I think is going to be very attractive to many people in Scotland. And I can say from my experience running up to 2014, there are many people, even amongst those who were not natural SNP or independent supporters, who would view the prospects of serving in Scotland, regardless of whether that's where they actually came from originally, as being an attractive one. So I don't have many concerns about that. And lastly, before wanting to hand over the microphone to somebody else, how important and what is the scale of reserve forces contribution to an independent Scottish Defence Force? In the white paper, after a 10-year transition period, Scottish Defence Forces were projected and budgeted for 15,000 full-time and 5,000 reserve. So that was kind of balanced 3 to 1. Right, that's enough for me. I can come back if there's anything specific to me, but I'll hand over to Stuart, Phillips, and Dorcha to pitch in after me.
Yeah, I think the one on the reserve and its possible role is definitely very live here at the moment in Ireland. And Stuart, you might have some thoughts on that as well.
Yes, well, I mean, I've just taken an arbitrary division on the contribution of regular and reserves in a hypothetical Scottish Defence Force, and I've just put it roughly at 70% regular and 30% reserve. But that's just pulling that figure out of the air, which applying common sense. Could I just take I noticed there were questions on recruitment, and in particular the whole context of why would anybody who wanted to join the military join the Scottish Defence Forces as opposed to the UK Defence Forces, and indeed, why would anyone in the UK services wish to transfer across to the Scottish Defence Forces on independence? And I think there's a number of answers that can be applied here, but it's pretty straightforward. If the Scottish Defence Forces offered better paying conditions, if they offered home basing or near to home basing, if they offered a guaranteed job on exit, and if they offered the facility that veterans care would not be, after service care, would not be palmed off to charity, but would be an integrated part of central government, then I think a lot of people would find that very attractive.
So that was one of the, another question related to that, Stuart. What happens if most personnel do not wish to transfer to the Scottish Defence Forces and remain in UK's Royal Navy, RAF or Army?
Well, of course there will be people that want to do that, and we haven't even explored the options of recruitment from the Scottish diaspora. I mean, you know, there's 5 times as many people. It's a bit like Ireland, actually. 5 times as many Scots or those of Scottish descent living outside Scotland than there are inside the country, and all these things need to be explored. But I think and the other thing I don't accept, by the way, I don't accept that opportunities for career advancement and exciting overseas postings would be very much diminished in a Scottish Defence Force as opposed to serving in the UK. I just don't accept that, because I don't think there will be a proportional reduction in commitments with things like embassies and defence attaché jobs, etc., etc. So I think there's a great deal of work that could be done to publicise the attractiveness of serving in a Scottish Defence Force as opposed to the UK Armed Services. But recruitment's always going to be a problem, but it's a recruitment, I mean, it's a problem for everybody. For example, you know, the British Army is target recruitment is 82,000. Well, it's at 73,500 roughly at the moment. So everybody's got problems.
Yeah. Just a switch, Phillips, maybe towards you, really. We, in the last referendum, and I mean, there's been another one in the UK since the last independent referendum, and that was the Brexit referendum. Both referenda were run in totally different ways. To a large extent, the British government stayed out of the independence referendum and allowed the two sides. How do you see the next one going? And one of the questions in is, you know, we have a lot of referendum here in our referenda. We had one very recently. We have them regularly. They can be very divisive, and that's our experience. And the question really is there a way to approach another independence referendum in such a way that the divisiveness can be mitigated? Get your thoughts on that.
In a way, no. I mean, you know, it's going to be an emotional identity issue, and I think it's very difficult to run. This isn't, say, having a referendum on a legal question. It really is a question of identity. Who are you, and what country do you wish to be part of? I think you can try not to inflame passion, but passion is going to be there. And I would say in my entire life, there was nothing more passionate that I've seen than the 2014 referendum. The feeling in Scotland, particularly in the week before the vote, and then in the few days after the vote, was unlike anything I had ever experienced. And I think there's going to be an intense emotional reaction. It's up to political leaders and the people to try and keep it from running out of control, which they did last time. I think that people on the whole did try to damp it down, but it's going to be there, and I'm not sure you can do anything to keep that. If I could say one thing, I was intrigued by both Angus and Stuart's position. And returning a bit to this issue of what independent Scotland would do with the nuclear weapons on the Clyde, and I think we have to be careful. We don't want to make the SNP can't pretend that all of a sudden it's like the Brexiteers saying we're going to tell the European Union everything. Scotland's not going to be able to tell our UK exactly what to do. They can talk like that now, but the RUK is going to be the very powerful negotiating position, and Scotland will need a lot to it. And I would argue that instead of actually talking tough and saying we're going to order all these nuclear weapons off the Clyde ASAP, which is impractical anyway, it's far better to actually try and reach a deal to get them out gradually. And I would say, if I could be somewhat more critical of some of the CND arguments about nuclear weapons and the Clyde and independent Scotland, for many people who back CND, they back the SNP, they don't really care about an independent Scotland, they just care about getting rid of nuclear weapons. And to be perfectly honest, I think they'd put Scotland in a terrible negotiating position to get what they want. They would actually want Scotland to be extreme and go to the RUK, say, get those weapons out now, because that will destroy the RUK's nuclear deterrent. And that's what we want. Well, if Scotland has to pick up the pieces by having its entire negotiating position destroyed by breakdown relations with the RUK, they'll have to deal with it. So I'm quite uncomfortable with a lot of what I would argue the CND ideology, which is not about Scottish independence at all. Scottish independence is in many ways simply a vehicle to achieve this. What I would argue is, I don't know if it's long-term basing is Stuart's way of that, you're going to keep nuclear weapons on the Clyde and have them paid for. But I think you want to give the RUK time to decide what they want to do. And that actually gives you time to decide what an independent Scotland will be. I mean, that's what we've talked about, this issue about recruitment. Who's going to come, who's going to go? We don't know. And what you want is you want time to actually try and put into place sensible structures. And negotiating in a friendly way with the RUK about nuclear weapons in the Clyde will give you that time. And in that time, you actually might gain some money, as Stuart said, through leasing out those bases. And actually, one of the things that also drives me a bit crazy about the CND argument, that's far more likely to get rid of the nuclear weapons in the long run. If your ultimate goal is to get rid of British nuclear weapons, RUK nuclear weapons, if you try to force them out too quickly, it's more likely the RUK will panic and try to rebase them and try to keep them. If you give the RUK time to say, okay, Scotland is leaving, what are we now? I think they're far more likely to come to the conclusion that keeping these nuclear weapons is simply not on now. The diminishment of the RUK by Scotland leaving, if allowed to sink into the political understanding, would on their own accord, I would argue, leave the RUK to say, okay, it's time to move on from it. But I probably answered about 6 questions there, and I apologize.
Well, a lot of the questions coming in have been about Fastlane, and also maybe just 1 or 2 of the comments I might read. There's one here from Peter Emerson, who's a retired lieutenant in the Royal Navy, ex-Fastlane and Rosyth, and also an international election observer. He says, major influence of any referendum in Scotland may well take place in other jurisdictions which are also faced with this possibility. The 2014 referendum was used by Russian separatists in Ukraine. Any binary referendum to be held in Northern Ireland could provoke violence, while any binary referendum in Xinjiang or Kashmir would probably be bloody awful, literally. Should Scotland not aspire to set a more peaceful international example and hold a multi-option referendum like the 6-option constitutional plebiscite in Guam? Such a multi-option poll would allow the voters to express their views on NATO, currency, and so on. After all, the Scottish National Party was in favour of a 3-option referendum in 1987 or 97, I'm not sure that is, and 2014. Maybe, Angus, you're the best man to respond to that.
Well, just very briefly, and thank you to Lieutenant Emerson for his question. Can I suggest that he has a look at the most recent paper produced by Sir John Curtis, who many of you will know is Scotland and the UK's foremost psephologist and researcher on public opinion. And for the first time, when given the 3 options of status quo, devolution, and independence, independence is the most favoured option. Putting a buffet of options before the electorate, when 58% of the electorate now wishes that Scotland should become a sovereign state, sounds to me more like a political ruse to try and divert the moves towards Scottish independence. Those who would wish a federal United Kingdom, those who would wish there to be strengthened devolution, there has been absolutely nothing to stop them developing such a policy platform, running for election, and if it's a popular option, winning election. At the present time, Scotland is governed by a party that hasn't won an election in my country since 1955. I've had enough. We've had enough, and we want something better. Now, if people want to come up with a federal solution, I've yet to hear one. There are many people on this call with a lot of experience, be really interested to hear a single example in the history of the world where there has been a multinational confederation where 85% of the population lives in a single part of that multinational state. It does not exist. It's a chimera. It is unworkable. I should say it has happened once, and that was a federation of Serbia and Montenegro, and that didn't last very long. So I would say if people want to come up with other proposals, knock themselves out. But the Liberal Democrats have existed for more, though Liberals and now Liberal Democrats have existed and said they're in favour of federalism for more than 100 years. They do not have a workable proposal to put forward. The British Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party has said it's in favour of Scottish Home Rule, and they've said that since the 1880s. Where are their plans? Where are their proposals? They're nowhere. So the choice we have is, do we stick with this little Brexit Britain, or do we take our destiny into our own hands? And I don't want to put off the questioner. If he has better ideas, please publicise them. Run for election. The party that is running, proposing that Scotland should be a sovereign state, is currently on 58% in the opinion polls. So it is a proposal with merit and public support. And if the public want to have their say and they want to vote for that, they should be able to do that. And going back to an earlier question, which in its own way is just as important, how do we hold a binary referendum on issues which by their very nature, people fall on either side of an argument? And it rests on all of our shoulders, people like me who have political responsibility, to do it in a way that paints a vision for my outcome being one that is also has a place for people who do not support that at the present time. And so it behoves us to make our case in a way that is welcoming for others. But in 2014, we held a referendum on a binary question, and it was, by most international standards, a model of a referendum on a constitutional question as being one of civility, different views, extremes on social media, no doubt, but we only need to look at the United States in recent days to see that, democracy in its presidential form or its parliamentary form or in a referendum form, by its very nature, involves choices, and people, frankly, should have that choice.
Thank you. So, a question for Dorcha. One of the questions that came in, if I can find it here, is what niche capabilities should a Scottish Defence Force focus on to build and maintain, and why?
Well, niche capabilities implies, of course, that Scotland would be, say, part of NATO, and it would focus on certain aspects of defence, but that means a detriment to the other. The thrust of my argument is that if you're going to have conventional armed forces, you have to have all the supporting elements. So the niche idea is there, but I certainly, given for a start that Scotland is an archipelago of 800 islands, that you should be talking maybe more about the naval side of things. This, I think, we in Ireland tend to think of army, and unfortunately, we don't give our naval service and air corps the type of credibility as components of defence forces. I would wish that the government would regularise that and call them Navy and Air Force the same, following best international practice. But in Scotland, the Navy will be very important, and you can see that that might be by far maybe the main, because of the nature of Scotland and the strategic orientation towards the north, which has been kind of touched on by Phil and by Stuart. But on the question of the niche thing, I'll actually pass this one to Stuart, because I know that Stuart has a view on this, a more informed one than mine.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I mean, obviously, I've been arguing for specialisation predicated on the fact that Scotland will belong to NATO and perhaps other EU or European-orientated alliances and coalitions. I just don't think that Scotland's, for example, famous contributor, the kilted soldier, I don't think that that's our strongest suit anymore. We have a very highly developed technical and medical and academic sector. And one of the things that I've just thrown into the argument when speaking elsewhere is that if we are going to specialise, then within the army, for example, perhaps an independent Scotland might say to itself, what we're going to do is we are going to produce the world's best equipped, most competently trained, most professional mobile field hospitals in the world, so that every operation, whether it be a military operation or a humanitarian operation, the first thing that goes on the list when people are saying we need to do something, who can we call on? Top of the list, 2 Scottish field hospitals. And I think that resonates also with the whole sort of the slight undercurrent of anti-militarism, which has been brought about by the UK's participation in Iraq and Afghanistan, and which fought on public opinion for all the obvious reasons. But I think the idea that we could contribute on the humanitarian side, and of course in the combat support side if need be, with units like that, and you could extrapolate that things to transport or special forces. But the one that I found has had most appeal is of a really world-class military medical system.
Which is, I suppose, given the pandemic, certainly here in Ireland, our defence forces have taken a major, well, very significant role in terms of supporting our health services. Now back to you again. One of the comments that came in by email is that, and it reflects an Irish perspective, question mark about how independent Scotland really can be. The comment is that seems there will be a lot of dependency still on alliances with NATO, EU, and rest of UK. And it seems an independent conventional army for an independent Scotland is not financially viable. And how much of the hard-won independence would be compromised to sustain the Scottish Defence Forces? And there was another question I thought I might bundle in with that. I know, Stuart, you kind of referred to it, but the level of GDP that would, is there? You mentioned a budget of about 1.3 billion, but there's a big push on within, particularly NATO, for countries to spend 2% on their defence. Maybe Phil, you might have some thoughts on that, on those two.
Would you want to speak? Do you want me to speak of that, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, the whole idea of Scotland becoming independent, and it all depends whether you accept the fact that, or you accept the Growth Commission report suggestion that there would be a period of fiscal austerity following independence, which I think if you look at it, I mean, I'm not an economist, but just with my sort of common sense head on, thinks may well be the case. Now, for a lot of people, that doesn't matter, but that may well be the case. Then what Richard Marshal and I've been trying to do, the thinking is that if there's going to be a huge amount of pressure on government finances, then the best thing that we could do is design an armed forces which is both credible and capable, but where the defence budget is reduced, and that's how we've come up with this specialisation, which leads into a reduced defence budget, and then the whole idea that you could actually make, if you like, some of that defence budget back by allowing other friendly nations and organisations to use some of the facilities in Scotland. We talked about Lossiemouth, we talked about Faslane, but there's the Cape Wrath bombing range, there's the Hebrides missile facility, and there's all sorts of other things that we don't talk about, which exist in Scotland. So I think that in the initial years, and it's a political decision, and Angus will know better than I, it's a political decision how big the defence budget is going to be. And all we've been doing is saying, here, you can have it inexpensively to start with, if that helps with the whole government revenue balance book in the early years of independence. But I mean, 1.6% of GDP would put it up to, I think, about £2.5 billion. Now, on our defence model, if you put it up to £2.5 billion, then you can have 2 squadrons of Typhoons. All I'm saying is that you don't have to go that way, because a bit like Ireland, You don't have to have your own, to own your air defense assets if someone else is providing them as a quid pro quo for using a base when they want to have it. And we haven't even explored the whole topic of, do you need to buy weapons or can you lease them? I mean, does anyone buy a car these days? No, you lease them basically on some sort of daft scheme with balloon payments and all that sort of stuff. And we haven't even explored that yet because we don't have the time. And but it's it's worthy of further debate. But I think I mean the size of the defence budget in the final analysis is a political decision, but it doesn't have to be huge.
Okay.
If I could add to that, I think the idea of the chance of it being 2%, if say Scotland has an independence referendum in 2 years, a year and a half, and it wins, the chance of there being a 2% defense budget is nil in the short term, unless all of a sudden there's a massive increase in the price of oil and the Scottish government's awash in revenue, because the revenue is not going to be there to support a large defense budget to begin with. And there will be some economic dislocation. So I assume the defense budget will be far below 2%. And I think, therefore, to be quite limited in your expectations, and to use this, as I've always said, to use it for time, to give yourself time to bed into a structure, to don't try and certainly be too ambitious too early, and to try and be cooperative with the RUK is all in Scotland's interest. We see, we look at Brexit, and in the Brexit negotiations, Scotland instantly becomes like Brexit Britain in relative power to the RUK. And we can look at all, Brexit, look what happened to that argument. Oh, it would go right away. We'll have article whatever, and we'll be out, and we'll get whatever we want, and milk and honey. No, it doesn't work like that. That it goes on for years and years, and you are often disappointed, and you get some of what you want, but a lot of what you don't want. And when it comes time to Scottish independence, I think you'd get independent, but the negotiations would be hard and they would be tricky, and they're best to be done in an amicable way that takes time to develop. And that helps with defense, to be perfectly honest. That gives you a cushion to try and sort of politically put together a more acceptable defense package. But it's not going to be a large budget, and certainly not going to be a large budget quickly, would be my guess.
And just I suppose to comment on that point about the reliance on alliances, particularly the NATO, EU, as well as the rest of the UK. Phil? Yeah.
For Scotland?
Yes, for Scotland, yeah.
I mean, absolutely. Well, Scotland has to be a cooperative member of the EU. Scottish independence now is based on a European identity, which is to be a full and enthusiastic member of the European Union. That is why we are at 56 to 58%, and that's sticking. I think what Angus has said, it's not just one poll now. What we have is an extraordinary run of polls that show a majority of Scottish people supporting independence, and that's because they want to be part of the European Union. Now, to get in the European Union and be an enthusiastic, and then that will also, that is a political issue which might bring up some issues with Spain and other countries. Scotland will have to be, I would argue, an enthusiastic member of NATO, or at least sort of a full member of NATO, to get everyone on board. And I know I've had discussions with people in Scotland. Well, why can't we be Ireland? We should be able to be Ireland. We should be able to not join NATO. And the problem is Scotland's in NATO now, and if Scotland leaves, that's a diminution. Ireland never joined, that's fine. But once you're in the club, you can't leave the club without weakening it. And I think that's why you have to play ball with NATO to get the kind of position you want in the European Union.
So it's 8:25, and time is moving very. So I don't think we're going to be able to take too many more of these questions, because I do want to give each panelist a chance to make one last remark. But I suppose to reflect the fact that this is the Irish Defence Forces Officers Club, one of the questions that came in, maybe Angus, can the panel see Scottish Defence Forces taking part in UN peacekeeping operations alongside the Irish Defence Forces? And maybe just to add to that, is there scope for joint Irish, Scottish, UN/EU contingents and for joint training? So I'll let you, Angus, take that one, yeah?
So very quick and simple answer to that. Yes, absolutely. In the same way as other panelists have said, I think Scotland has two particular, apart from the very obvious defending the homeland and protecting the civil power, particular roles and responsibilities. One is the maritime focus in and around our shores. The second is contributing to the international community that is in a European, NATO and UN capacity. Ireland has great experience. I myself have visited one of the Irish UN contingents on the Golan Heights. It's exactly the kind of thing that I would like to see Scottish service personnel as part of Scottish Defence Forces playing a part in. And obviously, after independence, the cooperation that an early Scottish Defence Department, I would hope, would pursue would be to work with governments who have particular experience in these areas. So in this case, on UN peacekeeping, working with the Irish government and your defence planners and senior IDF personnel would be as important as would be working with the likes of the Danes and the Norwegians, looking at our maritime focus and how we develop that. Just very quickly on budget envelopes and transition, again, for people who are interested in this, please have a look in the white paper. It is very detailed on how one would wish to transition over a number of years, not like Brexit, thought through, planned, costed, and committed to with capabilities in mind. We put a lot of time, a lot of effort into doing this for reasons that others have explained. Our neighbours, not least of whom are friends in the rest of the United Kingdom, need to know that Scotland is going to be a trusted, a trustworthy and capable partner. Scotland is a third of the landmass of Great Britain. We understand that with that comes responsibilities for which one has to spend money and have capabilities to provide safety, not just for yourself, but your neighbours too. And we take that seriously. And we obviously want to do this as quickly as one can possibly do, but we're also realistic that this will take time. It will involve transition. But I want to underline that our commitment was predicated on a European average NATO spend. That would give us a significantly larger spending envelope than is the case in Ireland at the present time, and that is because we require more than. And I'm not being critical of the Irish Air Corps or your naval service, but as Dorcha has already outlined, Ireland's a very heavy army component compared to the other two services. In Scotland, we will require, because of our maritime responsibilities, west, north and east, to have a maritime and an air capability, which is why I part company with Stuart on the requirement for air interdiction. We require that not just for ourselves, but also to support the likes of the Icelanders who have zero capability and require for their safety on a rolling basis fast jets from NATO, neighbouring NATO and friendly countries. And unlike the UK that is not taking that seriously, I aspire to Scotland taking the safety and security of our neighbours a lot more seriously, and that requires us stepping up to the plate, being prepared to spend the money. And yes, Stuart's made the point, difficult times, and we have to work out where the money comes from. But I would just leave you with this thought again, have a look at the white paper and some of the other sources where I've spoken about this before. A very, very significant part of Scottish taxpayers' contribution to UK defence is not spent in Scotland. So there's a net gain for us spending that resource in Scotland to provide the capabilities that we require to live up to our expectations domestically, but also to our neighbouring nations and friends in the rest of the current UK, but neighbouring countries like the Irish Republic, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland in particular as immediate neighbours.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time here. And one thing I want to do is, in the last couple of minutes, is just to bring people's attention to the chat function, where Phillips has uploaded a number of papers, including, as I mentioned earlier there, the white paper on Scotland's future, the Blue Bonnets Defending Independent Scotland paper, and also whatscotlandthinks.org from John Curtis and some of his ideas of Scottish independence and Brexit. You can also see from the number of comments and questions that we just didn't get around discussing that we could have gone on for another while, but I think it's time to thank everybody and maybe invite, we'll do the reverse, start with Dorcha in terms of final comment, and then we'll say goodnight.
Yeah, not just one or two very short points. The first thing about Scottish public opinion and the defence debate. I think that in the long run, an open and honest debate on defence in Scotland is required. Such a debate should lead to a better informed public and to a better understanding of Scotland and the UK's strategic defence interests. Some kind of forum is probably needed to explore ideas on how Scotland would provide for its defence. Perhaps Scotland might consider how an informal grouping of defence enthusiasts in Catalonia have come together and played a role in promoting interest in defence issues without being divisive. I'm talking about the Society of Military Studies of Catalonia, or SEM for short. On the Trident issue, in the long term, Trident will become a footnote in history as the world moves towards nuclear disarmament. Maybe in just 2-3 more decades, we don't know how long. But whether it is removed now or later should not be the determinant factor on the wider independence issue.
Thank you,
That's all I got.
Stuart.
Yes, I mean, I would just say that there's quite a lot of agreement actually. If you drew the Venn diagram of all the opinions expressed by the panel tonight, there'd be quite a big overlap in the centre of the diagram, and I think that's very encouraging. And bearing in mind that some of us are not members of the SNP, I think it's quite interesting because I have no doubt that an independent Scotland could organise its own armed forces and that they would be, in time, well recruited, professional, well equipped, and to pick up Dorcha's point, popular with the community. And I think that's very important. And particularly important is the need to reconnect territorial affiliations. I'm not saying let's restore the Scottish regiments, although that would be nice, but I think there needs to be some territorial affiliation which continues the tradition. When it comes to, my final point is, when it comes to discussing defence issues with an independent Scotland view, inevitably all roads lead back to Faslane. And that is the one that needs to be sorted out. All I would say is that I endorse what Phillips has said, is that Faslane is actually an independent Scotland's biggest bargaining chip when it comes to the independence, and it should wield that advantage very carefully. That's all I would say. And thank you very much for being part of the panel.
Thank you, Stuart. Phillips?
I've sort of spoken my piece. I'll say the final thing that politically, I think the idea of cooperation between Scotland and Ireland would have huge resonance in Scotland. In the 25 years I've been there, the growth of a pan-Celtic identity has been fascinating. And even in a city in Glasgow, which used to say would have rather divided views on this Celtic identity, I would argue that division has gone down significantly in the last 25 years. And Brexit has just turbocharged that. That all of a sudden now, the Scottish identity is tied up with Celticness and Europeanness far more than Britishness for many, many people who never would have seen themselves that way. So certainly any kind of system you could set up for defence cooperation between Scotland and Ireland would be, I think, very popular and productive. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So Angus, over to you.
Just very light. Well, firstly, can I finish on behalf of all the panelists by saying how much we appreciate the invitation by the Irish Defence Forces Officers Club. Thank you to all of the faceless participants that we can't see who are still listening at this hour to our contributions. Thank you very much in your interest in what is happening in Scotland. It's much appreciated. We've got a lot to learn from Ireland. And I would very much hope that we can continue this dialogue to make sure that as we approach what I believe is coming is another independence referendum, and with the momentum behind it, I hope, but also believe that will lead to a yes vote, that we can help find the right answers to the challenges and opportunities that Scottish sovereignty will bring, both to Scotland's immediate defence needs, interests, concerns and expectations, but also how that fits in and works with our neighbours and friends, very much so within the British Isles, so the rest of the United Kingdom, but also the Irish Republic and in particular our Nordic neighbours. I'll finish where I started off. For some time now, we have tried to think like a state, act like a state, think through what it is that we need to do. Stuart will remember the days going back the best part of 2 decades ago when things were not as professional as they are now. If I was to say to you that one of the more recent British ambassadors to NATO, Dame Margaret Leslie, is a supporter of Scottish independence and advises together with other people of significant experience and background, the thinking that goes into the case that we're making. You all who are watching and the panelists who are taking part in this, whether you agree with Scottish independence or not, please let me leave you with one thought, is that we are really serious about doing this as well as we can, because defence is the first responsibility of the state, and we owe that to people in Scotland, and we also owe it to all of our other neighbours to take that responsibility seriously, and we are doing that. And after we become independent, we will do that in concert with our neighbours, because we share so many defence and security priorities.
Thank you very much. So all that remains really for me is to thank all of you panelists for giving your time and your attention and your thoughts and insights, which are greatly appreciated. And to all the attendees who came on tonight, at one point I could see 75 attendees, which is very gratifying that there was such interest. And other people came and went as well earlier and later. So I'm sure the actual numbers at some point were higher than that. It's been an excellent and fascinating discussion. We will hopefully have a very good recording of all of this, which will be available on our YouTube channel for those of you who weren't with us at the very start in the next couple of days. So thank you all again, and have a very good evening, and look forward to at some point maybe talking to you again.
Thanks very much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, all.
Yeah.